Satellite images reveal the coronavirus may have begun in August, months earlier than thought. Chinese fighter jets enter Taiwan airspace. And Chinese propaganda everywhere. That and more on this week's China News Headlines. This is China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. The ongoing saga of the coronavirus is ongoing. There's been a new horrifying revelation. First, we learned that Wuhan officials spent weeks trying to cover it up. Then we learned that leaders at the highest levels of the Communist Party knew the coronavirus could become a pandemic 6 key days before warning the public. In those 6 days, the city of Wuhan, at the epicenter of the disease, hosted a mass banquet for tens of thousands of people, and millions began traveling through for Lunar New Year celebrations. All while health officials knew that human-to-human transmission was probably happening. And then we learned that the World Health Organization knew China wasn't being open about the coronavirus, even while they were praising China for its transparency. And now, this.
The US-based Harvard Medical School released a report claiming the virus might have spread in China as early as last August, months before it was first identified at a Wuhan seafood market in December. Researchers used satellite imagery of hospital parking lots in Wuhan and data from symptom-related queries on search engines for things such as cough and diarrhea.
Now, if this is true, that the coronavirus began in August, you know what that means. It's almost the coronavirus's birthday. How are you going to celebrate? I'm going to celebrate by never leaving my home again. And a toilet paper birthday cake. Of course, the Chinese Communist Party is not happy with the Harvard Medical School's report.
But I think it's ridiculous to come to this kind of conclusion based on superficial observations.
And she has a point. In China, they do science by drawing conclusions from meticulous observations, which means asking the party what the politically correct scientific conclusion is. Like when the party said traditional Chinese medicine could cure the coronavirus. Hua Chunying had this to add.
I think this should be handed over to scientists to come up with a scientific and fact-based result through scientific research.
Yeah, hand it over to the scientists, as long as they're not Harvard scientists, because the party's preferred Harvard scientists have been indicted for lying about illegal Chinese funding. The regular Chinese funding of Harvard is still totally fine, though. A Chinese manufacturer is being charged with exporting nearly 500,000 misbranded and defective masks that falsely purported to be N95 respirators. If it hadn't been caught by the US government, the company would have put first responders, hospital employees, and other frontline workers directly in harm's way with faulty equipment just to make a buck. A lot of European countries have seen similar quality problems with Chinese masks. The Chinese Communist Party had pushed Chinese companies to make and export masks, but failed to do meaningful quality control. And now, the coronavirus has been a PR disaster for the Communist Party. And not just because of the masks. For the first time ever, the EU is accusing China of being behind a huge wave of coronavirus disinformation. For example, French politicians were furious when a Chinese embassy website claimed in mid-April, at the height of Europe's pandemic, that care workers had abandoned their jobs, leaving residents to die. In other words, the Chinese embassy was trying to make French healthcare workers look irresponsible, which is ridiculous. Does China honestly expect us to believe that when the going got tough, the French would just up and surrender? But this is just part of an even bigger campaign of propaganda and disinformation by the Chinese regime. The New York Times just did an investigation into thousands of sketchy Twitter accounts. The article leads off. As the Trump administration lashes out at China over a range of grievances, Beijing's top diplomats and representatives are using the president's favorite online megaphone, Twitter, to slap back with a pugnaciousness that is best described as Trumpian. Wow, the New York Times managed to turn an investigation into Chinese propaganda into an attack on Trump. I think they unlocked a new achievement. Anyway, back to the thousands of sketchy Twitter accounts. Many of these accounts were filled with reposts from official Chinese accounts. 1/3 of the accounts had been created in the last 3 months. 1 in 7 had 0 followers. So either they're bots or Chinese Communist Party propaganda is just very unpopular these days. And stay tuned after the break because Hong Kong's most famous bank has decided to kowtow to the Chinese Communist Party. Hundreds of people rallied in Hong Kong this Tuesday. They were marking the anniversary of the June 9th million-person march that kicked off the past year of unrest.
Protesters young and old marched together in defiance of social distancing limits that ban gatherings of more than 8 people.
And Hong Kong police celebrated their anniversary of pepper-spraying protesters by pepper-spraying protesters. This comes as the Chinese Communist Party is forcing a national security law on Hong Kong that would basically make criticism of the Communist Party illegal. And guess who's backing the Communist Party? Major banks! They get a lot of business from the communists.
Major banks, HSBC and Standard Chartered backed China's new national security law for Hong Kong on Wednesday in a break from their usual policy of political neutrality.
HSBC began in Hong Kong, but is now making billions in China. HSBC is also making everyone really mad. It's taking heat from all sides. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo criticized HSBC for its corporate kowtow to China. Unfortunately, a corporate kowtow is the only way that companies can do business with China. But Pompeo has really been on a roll lately, calling out the Chinese Communist Party. This week, he also slammed Beijing's laughable propaganda exploiting the George Floyd protests. It reminds me of last year during the Hong Kong protests when Chinese state-run media implied that if protests like this were happening in the U.S. police would use real bullets. And when the U.S. did have massive protests, not only did police not use real bullets, but Congress introduced a bill on police reform, whereas in Hong Kong, the police were cleared of any wrongdoing. Yep, absolutely no police brutality in Hong Kong. Speaking of Hong Kong, last week, thousands of Hong Kongers showed up to the annual June 4th vigil to commemorate the Tiananmen Square massacre, even though the government had banned the gathering because of the coronavirus. Now, Hong Kong police are telling organizers that they will be prosecuted for the vigil because it was an illegal assembly. But Hong Kong is not the only place where it's getting hard to commemorate the Tiananmen Square massacre. That is, if you consider online platforms a place. That's right, Zoom, the video conferencing platform used by 300 million people around the world, closed the account of a group of prominent US-based Chinese activists after they held a Zoom event commemorating the 31st anniversary of the June 4th Tiananmen Square massacre. Tiananmen Square activist and friend of the show, Zhou Fengsuo, held a Tiananmen event on Zoom on May 31st. A week later, his Zoom account was suspended. Zoom also deactivated another account that was in the middle of hosting a separate Tiananmen event on June 3rd. And it also suspended the account of a Hong Kong activist. Each of these Zoom accounts and events was created and hosted outside mainland China, but appeared to be quashed under Chinese government pressure after they were publicly advertised. Meanwhile, Zoom is falling back on the good old, "we need to comply with local laws" defense. Zoom said it was obliged to respond to requests from Chinese authorities, as long as users in China participated in video conferences. So, Zoom is saying that Chinese authorities asked it to suspend those accounts. Good. Nothing at all to worry about. Now, the hosts of all of these events used Zoom because it's not yet blocked in mainland China. Zoom wants to stay in China, which is why it's practicing its own corporate kowtow. The U.S. has sent 2 aircraft carriers to the Pacific to boost the U.S. naval presence in an area marked by tension with China over territory. tension, like how Chinese fighter jets briefly entered Taiwan's airspace on June 9th. Don't worry, Taiwanese Air Force jets drove them away. Speaking of Taiwan, citizens there just ousted a major pro-China politician. That was Han Kuo-yu. He was the mayor of Kaohsiung, a city that has just overwhelmingly voted to remove him from office in a recall election. But you may remember him as the guy who was running for president of Taiwan just a few months ago, pushing a platform of deeper ties with mainland China. Yeah, things went downhill for him pretty quickly. Being tied to the CCP is just becoming really unpopular. Unless you're talking about a nuclear arms deal, then everyone wants you to join the party. The US and Russia will be holding nuclear talks in June, and China is invited. I mean, Russia and China are already close. In fact, they're working together to protect Iran from US sanctions. You know what they say, teamwork makes the dream work. U.S. Customs and Border Protection have seized over $250,000 worth of counterfeit bills sent from Shanghai to Milwaukee. I don't know how they discovered it. I mean, the bills look pretty good to me. I mean, other than the fact the currency was made of poor material, was missing the required watermark, had no red and blue embedded fibers, each bill had the same serial number, and there were Chinese letters on the back of the bills in red. Other than that, they were flawless, just like the complexion of a certain Pooh Bear I know. Doesn't look fake or anything. And now it's a time when I answer questions from you, my loyal 50-cent army, fans of the show who support what we do through the crowdfunding website Patreon. Today's question comes from Leander Williams. Hey Chris, do you think that the United States should fund a Japanese-style fund to cover costs for factory transplantation from China? Oh, very interesting question. So, Japan has created a $2.2 billion fund to encourage Japanese businesses to get out of China. $2 billion will go to firms that come back to Japan. The rest is for companies that just get out of China and go literally anywhere else. So, should the US do something similar? Well, it may not be necessary. A lot of US companies have already started moving manufacturing out of China just because of the trade tariffs. It's not as cheap as it used to be. Also, the coronavirus showed the problems with having all our supply chains in China. And there are plenty of other reasons for US companies to get out of China that don't involve needing to get extra money from the US government. In other words, getting money from American taxpayers. But some officials, like National Economic Council Director Larry Kudlow, have floated the idea that the US government could do something, like help pay the moving costs of American companies leaving China, which could be something like what Japan is doing. Thanks for your question, Leander. And for all of you watching, consider joining the China Uncensored 50-cent army. You'll have a chance to ask me questions on the show, and there are some other cool perks as well. Check out patreon.com/ChinaUncensored to learn more. And be sure to subscribe and check back every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday for new episodes, because YouTube isn't always sending out notifications about new episodes. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. See you next time.